With this being the week of Valentine's Day, we've turned our focus to love and companionship. Everyone needs both in their lives. Our speaker today is Leora Hoffman. She's no relation. She's not my sister. She's not my cousin. We do kind of look alike. She's made a career as a professional matchmaker. Formerly trained to be a lawyer, she was a practicing attorney in the field of criminal justice. Leora has worked in the Office of the Attorney General of DC as Assistant Attorney General in the Child Protective Division. But in following her passion, she focused on her matchmaking company. Since 1989, she has been responsible for 82 marriages and hundreds of long-term relationships. She specializes in the 50+ demographics. Hey, us old people need love too. It's a pleasure to welcome Miss Leora Hoffman.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm absolutely delighted, post-Valentine's Day, to be here to discuss the topic of love and matchmaking. Consider me the ambassador of love. Yeah. And I hope all of you had a lovely Valentine's Day, those of you who are celebrating it. I stand here today before you as a hopeless romantic. I could not be anything other than a hopeless romantic to have run this business for 33 years. And I also stand for the proposition that enduring love is possible at any stage, at any age. As Sterling said, I specialize in the 50+ demographic, and that is a population who are especially capable of beginning new relationships, having had the heavy lifting of raising families and creating careers behind them. And so I'm privileged to represent a population of people who are successful and really want to share their success with other people in their lives. So as a matchmaker of 33 years, and as one who is now in my third marriage, I like to call it my Goldilocks marriage. My husband, Jim, and I have been married for 10 years now, and I look at my prior 2 marriages as preparation for the real deal. So how does a Washington lawyer become a matchmaker, you might wonder? Well, like most things in life, it's about timing. I was at a point in my life, in my first marriage, where I had just given birth to my second child. My first was 3 years old, and I was working for a federal agency as an attorney at the time. And I felt like I needed more flexibility with my schedules, my career. So I was a little restless about my job that I was planning to return to after my maternity leave. The opportunity. My sister, who lived in New York at the time, which is where I grew up, if you can't tell, called me and said, Leora, I'm thinking of doing something desperate. I said, what? And she said, I'm thinking of hiring a matchmaker. And I said, oh, that's interesting. Tell me about that. And she told me about a service on Madison Avenue in Manhattan that in the late 80s started their fees at $30,000 and on up. And I said, wow, that's a lot of money. But you just gave me a brainstorm for my next career. And she, being a therapist, said, what kind of crisis are you having with your profession? And I said, never mind that. I don't know of anyone who's doing that work in this community. And at the time, this is pre-internet. So all you had were large dating services, which really did not cater to professionals, or the pastor or the rabbi's wife who was volunteering to do this work from home, and nothing in between. So I felt that here was a perfect opportunity, knowing inherently the number of single professionals that come to this city for professional reasons, and having at the time so many single friends who were working long hours and like ships in the night, unable to meet one another. I decided that it would be a wonderful business opportunity. Plus, I had a passion for bringing love into people's lives. I have always wanted to be in helping professions, which is what drew me to the legal profession. And from the time I was a little girl on the steps of my house, my apartment building in Brooklyn, I was always involved with relationships and involved in the drama and intrigue from childhood on. And for some reason, I always had an instinct about people and wanted to put those skills to practical use, knowing that in Washington, there are no shortage of very talented lawyers. I thought to myself, well, here's an opportunity to distinguish myself. There's tons of lawyers, but there really are very few matchmakers. And so I went to a business consultant and he helped me develop a business plan. And at the time, he told me to write a book, which would be a great marketing piece. However, I had no idea what to write at the time. So here it is 33 years later. I finally wrote my book, which I'll tell you about in a minute. But before then, I wanted to talk about relationships and what the elements of matchmaking are all about. I have tried very hard to distinguish myself from the stereotype of Yenta from Fiddler, because even though it's very popular in folklore, that persona is not a very attractive one. It makes the men run in the other direction, in fact. So I wanted to appeal to a professional person who's got standards, who is a hardworking person, who doesn't have a whole lot of time, and who wants qualified leads to develop relationships, not dates. So what is the secret sauce to what I do in terms of successful matching? Well, my formula is as follows: common goals, common values, good chemistry, plus a pinch of humor. And I do start with the premise that love and relationships are complicated, that nothing is perfect, and that the bottom line is it's about connection. So let's talk about the elements, common goals. I'll tell you a story of Ned and Jane, who I matched when I first began my career. Ned was a law professor, and he was 40, looking to start a family, settle down and start a family. Jane was a 36-year-old attorney, a young associate in a law firm in DC. Two very attractive people. And so they both wanted marriage and family and had a lot in common. So I introduced them. And the next day, I got a call from Ned saying, well, I can see why you introduced us. Jane is lovely, she's smart, she's got a great personality, but I don't think she's for me. I said, why not? And he said, well, she's working at least 60 hours a week. I just can't envision her as a wife and mother, and that's what I'm looking for. So I said to him, Ned, please don't make the mistake of assuming that because she's working 60 hours a week now as a single woman, that would necessarily be her inclination were she to get married and start a family. I happen to know that she's not on a partnership track, that she wants to remain an associate, and if she were to be married, she would only want to work part-time. And also, by the way, at the annual law firm picnic, she's always the one doing the cooking. Well, that was persuasive to him. So he decided to give Jane a chance. And in fact, they dated for 6 months, but sadly it did not work out. Why? Because Jane told me that she found him boring after 6 months. So they had to move on from that. Element number 2, values. Values are really the foundation of any good relationship. And without which, even though there might be a wonderful attraction and a lot of common interests, if people don't share the same values, it's not going to work in the long run. Perfect example, Larry, a 42-year-old physician who was living in the Annapolis area, who was my client, who came to me for me to do executive recruitment for him. I introduced him to Nancy, a 37-year-old hospice nurse. And I thought, well, they couldn't have more in common. They're both in the medical field. They're both caring, giving, generous people. And so, and my instinct said that they would have good chemistry between them. And I was right. However, Larry called me the next morning and said, not going to work, Leora. And I said, why not? And he said, well, we were meeting at a very nice restaurant at the harbor in Annapolis. And she parked in a handicapped spot. Now, anyone who's going to park in a handicapped spot who's not handicapped is not someone I could ever develop a relationship with. And I completely got that. The problem was that I could not possibly anticipate that. I wasn't going to tell Nancy before the date, oh, remember not to park in a handicapped spot. Just as I didn't say to the gentleman who, after a very successful dinner at an upscale restaurant, walked through the bar with his date and stood there for 15 minutes watching the football game on TV, while she stood there just, looking stupid. There are many things that a matchmaker can't possibly anticipate. And so that is one of the things that, present themselves in the field. And as I get to know people, chemistry. I could give a whole lecture about chemistry. We know when it's there, we know when it isn't. So the positive chemistry speaks for itself. I don't have to be getting feedback from people extensively for them to tell me we clicked, it's great, we want to see each other. And I have hit many home runs out of the starting gate. In fact, the very first two people I introduced as an experiment for me to decide whether to go down this road professionally were two people who fell in love in 20 minutes. They met downtown for a wonderful dinner in Georgetown and ended up sitting on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial kissing till 1 o'clock in the morning. She called me the next day. She said, Leora, forget law. You have found your calling. And they are still married today, 30 years later, raised 2 children, and she's my closest girlfriend. So that does happen, but that's the exception rather than the rule. Typically, it's a question of trial and error, introducing people, getting feedback, and figuring out if it didn't work, which direction to head in. We also understand negative chemistry. Negative chemistry also speaks for itself. One can never anticipate that, obviously. I had a situation where a gentleman called me the next day after a date, and I said, how did it go? And he said, well, let's put it this way, Leora. I offered to drive her to her car since we were parked a distance away from the restaurant. And as we were driving along, we stopped at a red light, and she turned to me and said, don't bother pulling up to the curb, I'll jump out right here. I thought, oh, that's harsh, but I would call that anti-chemistry. But chemistry can also develop slowly and by surprise. And that is one of the narratives I go into in my book, as well as things that I've seen in my practice for over the decades. Take Jill and Eddie. Jill was a physician who moved down from Connecticut to join a medical practice. And Eddie was a scientist who had previously dated a woman who was divorced with 4 children and became very attached to the children and decided that although she was not the one for him, that he wanted to meet someone who wanted to start a family with him. So children were high priority for him. They were wonderful people, attractive people, and I introduced them. And Jill called me and said, and she was my client, I had recruited Eddie for her. So she said, Leora, I completely understand why you introduced us. He is a very special man, but I'm just not sure about the chemistry. I know he likes me, but I don't know what to do. What do you think? So I said, well, if I were you, recognizing the fact that he is so special and that men like that don't come along every day, I would just develop a friendship with him. spend time with him, get to know him, see where it might go. So she said, that's a good idea. It's not hard. We got along beautifully. There was no shortage of conversation. I can do that. 3 months later, she called me. She said, Leora, we're inseparable. I said, what happened? She said, well, to tell you the truth, I was a little self-conscious when we first met. I wanted to lose 10 pounds. I didn't feel that I was at my fighting weight, quote unquote. So I lost 10 pounds and he looked better to me. And what that told me was that she didn't feel that she was at her very best and was self-conscious about it. And therefore, the chemistry wasn't going to kick in on her part because she was too hung up. He was a very patient man. He really liked her, and he knew that she was well worth waiting for. And today they are happily married and raised 2 beautiful daughters. So that was a lesson to me as well. Humor. That's another really critical element in a good relationship. Take Bill and Adele, who were a couple in their senior years. And I do a lot of work in the senior community as well, because loneliness is a very big problem among seniors. And it is, my goal to really dedicate myself to helping them with that. And so Bill was divorced, an 82-year-old gentleman, very generous, family man, wonderful guy. And Adele was widowed, 79 years old. And so Bill took her out for a beautiful dinner, really liked her right away, was, quite taken with her. And the next day, Adele called me. She said, what a nice guy, so generous, such a gentleman. However, he's not a really good listener. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, I was telling him about my journey, my family, my life story, and I just didn't feel like he was listening very well. So I then, as I always do, practice shuttle diplomacy by getting feedback on both parts. And so I went to Bill and I basically said, what's up with that, Bill? And he said, oh, I'm so embarrassed, Leora. I forgot my hearing aids at home. Now, again, would one anticipate something like that? Would I say, and don't forget your hearing aids at home before the date? No, stuff just happens. And if people are meant to be, I believe they will be. There can be humor and forgiveness in that situation. And when I explained it to Adele, she was very happy to give him another chance. And they went out a few more times. But what happened was, in the meantime, Bill moved into an assisted living facility and got inundated with women going after him. And he called me and said, let's put my membership on hold. I have lots of options now. So, so nothing is simple or easy. And as I said earlier, the right relationship is not, a simple thing, but it is a life-altering thing when it happens. And so I wrote my book 30 years then, into my practice to talk about all the anecdotes and the stories of my clients who got together successfully, the ones I tried to get to successfully matched, who didn't, and all the others in between where, but for my intervention, they would not have moved forward. And at the same time, I was twice divorced. And people would say to me, Leora, why do you think you can do this work if you're twice divorced? And I was a little embarrassed to be asked that question, but my answer was, first of all, we are all much more objective when it comes to other people. You would not have a surgeon performing surgery on oneself. And just like anything else, it's easier to see other people objectively. But my answer was also, I've learned from my past marriages, and I'm waiting for the right one to come along, and I make no apologies for that. And so I was single for 12 years before I was introduced to my husband, Jim, through friends, actually. So I had my own matchmaker. And so my book started as a marketing piece with client anecdotes and very quickly began to be a cathartic journal of my own search for love and all the challenges that I had in finding the right relationship. Going back to my first love in college and all the way through my 2 divorces and my courtship with Jim. And in fact, he is a forensic psychologist, and he wrote the foreword to my book, which is quite interesting. So in the book, I chronicle the takeaways from each relationship, each situation that didn't work out, the happily ever afters. There's Annabelle and Harvey, who came from totally opposite backgrounds. She was a Sephardic Jewish woman from Casablanca, Morocco, and he was an American, a Presbyterian guy from the Delaware Shore. She was a woman who approached me at one of my first presentations when I began the business, and I was out there networking and building up a following. She came up to me and she said, in a darling French accent, "Leora, I have psychics in my family, and I know you're going to introduce me to my husband." And I thought, oh my goodness, she's nuts. What am I going to do with this? Well, we befriended one another. She was so charming. She really could not afford my services, but we began a barter situation where she would babysit my children because she had a degree in early childhood education, and that I would introduce her. And my children took to her like an auntie. They just absolutely fell in love with her. And 5 years later, I introduced her to Harvey. Harvey came to me through a therapist contact of mine in Baltimore, who called me up and said, "Leora, I have a really special client. He's very inexperienced with women. In fact, he was a virgin at 50 years old." She said he came from a very toxic family background. He had a very difficult mother, a difficult older sister, and he's terrified of relationships, but he is a good man. And might you have anyone who he could meet? And I thought of Annabelle, who had been around the block a number of times and who was really looking for nothing more than a good man. And she was very financially challenged. He came from a wealthy background. And so I introduced them, and they fell in love, and she moved into his beach home in Delaware. They later moved down to Florida to take care of his aging mother, and they lived happily ever after. And sadly, she passed away 2 years ago. And actually, Harvey invited me to the unveiling in Florida, and I spoke there about their love, which was really just a beautiful thing to behold. Then there are couples who didn't quite work out. Sarah and Mark, for one, described in my book in detail. They got engaged, but then family pressures really tore them apart, sadly. And so they stepped back from their marriage plans, and I referred them to a very talented therapist who is still actually working with Sarah today. The relationship did not work out, but they both learned a lot from it and became very enriched from it. Then there was Betty and Phil, who were really, everyone I've worked with has been an interesting and special person, in my opinion. Everyone has special things to bring to a relationship, in my opinion. And so did they. Phil was a recent newcomer to the DC area from Toronto, an amazingly handsome guy, like Hollywood handsome. And I introduced him to Betty, who was a very pretty teacher. And they had their first date walking around the National Zoo. And he called me the next day and he said, lovely person. I had a great time, but she's not for me. And I said, why? And he said, well, I just don't think she's my type physically. And I said, oh, okay. I never argue with people. If that's their experience, then I have to respect that. And so I said, but tell me more about your time together. And he said, well, we spent the day at the zoo. I said, the day? He said, yes. I said, how long were you together? How many hours were you together? He said, 8 hours. I said, my goodness, that's a long first date. He said, you must have had a lot to talk about. He said, we did. I like her a lot. You know, she's a lovely person. I'm just not sure I'm attracted to her. So again, I encouraged them to spend some more time together. And eventually he fell for her. They got married. They had 2 beautiful daughters. And then about 10 years later, I was at a singles function and I ran into Betty. And I thought, oh my goodness, you obviously are single. What are you doing here? And I was a little embarrassed. And she said, Leora, you have nothing to be upset about. She said, he is a wonderful man, but years into our marriage, after our daughters were born, he decided that he was gay and he wanted to go down that road. And I decided that since we had two daughters, we were going to stay friends and we were going to be partners in raising these girls. And we have been ever since. And I thought, well, how special is that? You know, I really don't have anything to be upset about or, you know, to be self-conscious about. You know, people change and evolve over the years and become who they are. And it's inevitable that not everybody is going to go off into the sunset together. But for the couples I introduced who brought children into the world, that is a very, very special gift. And really the best part of doing this work. I'll give you a funny story. My husband, Jim, and I were at Montgomery Mall exploring whether to buy a sleep number bed one day. And so we were in the store, laying on the bed with the remote controls, maneuvering them up and down. And I'm laying there and all of a sudden I hear somebody say, Leora, is that you? And I sat up and realized it was a couple I had introduced and they were there with their 2 children. And Jim always loves to hear these stories and to see evidence of my efforts. And they said, kids, if it weren't for this woman, you wouldn't be here today. And, you know, that made me feel so wonderful because that was not an easy match. That was another one where at first he was not so keen on the match. And I pointed out that she was in high demand in the community and like a hot property on the market. If he didn't act quickly, she would no longer be available. And so he took my advice and they married and he grew up a little bit, you know, and so that was another thing. So my book is really for singles, a message of hope that love is possible at any stage and any age. And for couples, it's also a message that relationships take work. They don't happen by magic. And my husband and I are living proof of that. We got together later in life. I'm his 3rd wife as well. And when you get together at that stage in life, you're already cooked, you know who you are, your personality is well established, and there are bound to be conflicts. I mean, it's inevitable. So we have sought counseling with a very talented therapist that we touch base on about once a month, just to kind of do a tune-up for our marriage. And it has really enriched our relationship. And I highly recommend it for everyone who's in a relationship because we all need support. And I'm a lifelong learner and I really like to learn how to be a better partner and, you know, how to be a more loving partner. And so, again, you know, it's really a question of devoting the energy and making it a priority. So in closing, I want to thank you for your attention today. And remember that it's not about perfection. It's all about connection. And don't forget to keep laughing. And I'll tell you one final story. So when I first began my career, a woman called me on behalf of her 37-year-old son, who was a very shy accountant named Danny. And she said, Leora, I want to hire you on Danny's behalf to find him a partner. He's such a nice guy, but he has trouble meeting women. And so she actually came to the consultation when I met with Danny for the first time, which was highly unusual. But since she was writing the check, I figured I wasn't going to tell her not to come. And Danny, it was fine with Danny as well. And he turned out to be a really sweet man who I wanted to help very much. So I introduced him to a first prospect, a woman named Gail, who was a teacher, and they hit it off. They dated for 3 months. And finally, the time came for him to take her home to his mother. And he did. And she didn't like Gail. So Danny called me up and said, it's not going to work. So I thought, oh no, this is really unfortunate. So I went back to my network, and about a month, not even a month later, I found him a second prospect, a woman named Evie, who was a social worker. And to my delight, they hit it off. They dated about 6 weeks. And this time, Danny thought, well, I better bring her home sooner. I don't want to waste too much time, just to make sure she would get their seal of approval. So he indeed did that. And once again, the mom put the kibosh on the relationship. And so here I was so frustrated. I thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to tear my hair out with this one. You know, what am I going to do? And so in the course of my networking, I recruit from the community at large, not only from my pool of clients. I ran into a woman named Abby, who was the spitting image of his mother, a younger version. I thought, oh, wow, what a coincidence. And she had her mannerisms. I was floored. So I said, oh, well, we can't lose with this one. So I introduced him to Abby, and he liked her, and they began dating. He brings her home to his parents, and what happened? The father couldn't stand her. So, you know, sometimes you can't win. But as I said, this has been the most fulfilling way that I could have, you know, spent my career. And the beauty of this career is that, like Yenta, I can get as old as I want, and I'll only get better at it. So I am happy to answer any questions that anybody
Thank
might
you.
have.
We have time for one question, and it better be a good one, Mr. Day.
Thank you. So it sounds to me as though you're dealing with people who have greater challenges than simply relationships, and as though you're dealing with societal problems that probably you alone can't solve. You have people who don't have communities meet each other. Look, if you're choosing your wife based on what your mom and dad think, that's a much deeper problem than just meeting the right girl. If you are, admittedly, happens all the time, you're marrying someone who does not fit with your sexual orientation, that's a problem too. You got people in lives that are problems. So question is, how do you deal with the larger problems that many of these people seem to face beyond relationship problems?
That's a good question. And my answer to that is that I have always had the philosophy of accepting people where they are and for who they are. And as a matchmaker, I believe that there's a lid for every pot. So if somebody is a codependent type like Danny, well, then he needs a woman who's going to have the same family values and is not going to have a problem with the fact that he's so close to his mother, and might even welcome that. Maybe she comes from a background where she didn't have a lot of family connection and would embrace that. So I am not capable of solving society's problems, but I can look at each person's needs and assess the kind of partner who could potentially find them happiness given where they are. In fact, I just recently took on a young woman with special needs. She's developmentally delayed, and I have a son with autism. And so I also have a passion for helping people with disabilities. And she has now met 3 young men. I haven't found the match yet, but she's had the experience of going out on Saturday nights and having somebody take her out to dinner and text her. And it's been life altering for her. And so I feel very proud of that. And so you're never going to, as I said, cure people, but I do have a team. I work with therapists I refer people out to. I work with image consultants for people who need to step it up a little bit. And I think it takes a village in some ways. I collaborate with my colleagues, other matchmakers. And so, I think that nothing is simple.
We have some books back here, but for those who are online, how could they order your book if they want it?
Oh, thank you. Yes, my book is available on Amazon. And it is also available through my website on the homepage. There is a link to my book, leorahoffman.com. In the back, I have copies of my book for sale if anyone's interested. And also I have business cards. So please feel free to take a card and follow up with me. I would love to hear feedback from the book if anyone has the opportunity to read it. I would be happy to sign books for anyone who purchases it today. So thank you again for your attention. This has been a pleasure.
On behalf of the Rotary Club of Washington, D.C., I am pleased and proud to present you with this certificate signifying our commitment to plant a tree in your honor in our nation's capital. Thank you for coming. And we will send you a link to the GPS coordinate so you could see where your tree is being planted.
I'm honored. Thank you.
Thank you.